Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
While we're largely shaped by our Side B, post-liberal, localist, and multi-ethnic perspectives, and we'll explain each of these perspectives on the show, we're eager to engage a variety of voices. Hello! Today we are talking about a controversial topic
For some.
terminology. Yeah, it's often can be very divisive in the Christian churches in the US and around the globe. I hope that we can give a fair representation of all perspectives. It is just TJ and I speaking today. We don't have any guests, but we really hope that we can give a full perspective that is really helpful to understand the different reasons that people have as they come to this topic around what labels and terminology they may or may not use when describing sexual orientation and such.
There's been a lot of ink spilled on this question, so we're not the first to talk about this, of course, and you can find other conversations, and we might include other conversations in our show notes, but I thought it was important enough for us to talk about because it still comes up even now, you know? Like I've been part of the Side B community for 3 years or so, and it still comes up amongst some, and it came up 3 years ago as well. So I'm happy we could talk about it here. Let's first talk about the terms we use to describe ourselves, just to kind of position ourselves in the conversation, and it will help us build a foundation for the related topics we'll talk about afterwards. So David Frank, how about you start? What term do you describe yourself? And can you talk about your history with the label and like why do you find it helpful or useful for you in your life? So.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, didn't even really know, in high school, I was definitely just like, well, no, I'm not gay. Like that was kind of the only language, even though I was experiencing same-sex attractions. And so I was trying to rid myself of them. And in college, I think is the first time that I used the word gay to describe myself because I was having coffee with someone who described themselves as gay. And I could just say, yeah, I'm gay too. And it was just a simple way of communicating that I also am attracted to men predominantly rather than women. So it was just at that point, it was kind of casual, but in other circumstances, I definitely wouldn't use that language with most people, afraid of what they might think of me. And so other times I would use language around, oh, I'm same-sex attracted, or, I'm attracted to men. Or something along those lines. And then I'd say in the last, 5 years, occasionally throw it around queer as a more umbrella term because it's like sometimes people want to pigeonhole with gay, and then queer, they're just like, oh, we kind of know what that means. It says something, but doesn't say a lot. And very often I just say, I'm not straight because it's a lot easier to say what you're not without pigeonholing you into what people might think when you're trying to describe it in a more positive sense. So actually, it really depends on the context of what language I'm using, who I'm talking to, what I think their framework is. Sometimes I can just say, oh, I'm a Side B Christian or something, and maybe they know what that means.
Yeah, I get that you're pretty open to shift your terminology to a certain situation. But is there one that feels most sincere to you, or not really? How does that work for you?
It still kind of depends on the week. I think, it really changes. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, queer or gay feel really at home, and other times it's like, those sit a little heavy, and I will just be like, nah, it's just same-sex attracted, and I kind of actually like queer and same-sex attracted maybe the most because they both feel like umbrella terms that don't pigeonhole. In that, what I mean by that is, let's say you're equally attracted to men and women. You could fall under the umbrella of queer or the and still the umbrella of same-sex attracted.
Yeah, I get that.
I know a friend who would say that she's like 80% attracted to men and like 20% attracted to women. But that's enough for that she would just call herself queer.
Sure. Hmm.
Um, and I say gay, people assume that it'd be impossible for me to fall in love with a woman. And that's just not how it works. And that's not been my experience. So
Hmm.
I think that's why I like using the more general ones.
Hmm. Have you ever had anyone in your life who have told you what to say? Or has it mostly been your decision, figuring it out with your kind of your intimates, your local
Hmm.
people about how to talk about
When I shared a kind of testimony on the aspect of my sexuality and my walk with Jesus,
it?
my pastor had hesitation with me describing my sexuality as queer.
Hmm.
And in that, I knew my audience. And so I I did want to use the word queer, but I purposely, I don't know if people caught this nuance, but I would always use those adjectives to describe my sexuality
Uh-huh.
and not to describe me, just to add this kind of like extra layer of distance so that they would know that I'm not trying to like overly identify with this in case they were worried.
Got it.
And I just told my pastor, like, I'm not predominantly interested in ministering to in this sharing people who are worried about using the right language, but I'm really, hoping that I can minister to people who would actually associate with that experience, who might look inside their own life and say, oh, this person says, like he has experienced a queer sexuality and he's following Jesus that, connects with them.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. And so, but yeah, definitely have other church members who are very suspicious of using that language,
Hmm.
of using gay or queer. And we can talk a bit later why some reasons people give. And I had an acquaintance who didn't want me to even same sex, like I am same sex attracted, was felt too
Yeah.
close to identifying with this part of my sexuality.
Uh-huh.
So
What
people
did
have
they
given that
want? What
input
do they want you to say instead? Or,
to not use I am
oh,
language, to
okay.
talk more directly to like, oh, these are experiences I've had, or these are attractions that have been there.
Hmm.
And just so speak in that kind of, I don't know, whatever that is, like, that's not third person, but just more like one layer of distance. I'm talking about my experiences
Hmm.
and my feelings, not about
Me.
me.
Yeah, I get
Yeah.
that. I
Yeah.
think we should take a step back just to be clear for any audience who's more new to the conversation. What we mean by maybe like queer terminology, which will come up and maybe mentioned again, is words like queer or gay or lesbian or bisexual or like I guess those are the main ones, right? That people might use in
Yep.
contemporary US English and other Englishes as well. And then it's sometimes in the
Hmm.
Christian community contrasted with same-sex attracted. So that's we're not going to get into this too much. We'll talk about it, I think, in a future podcast more. But that's kind of some of the common options on offer that people might
Hmm.
use to
Hmm.
talk about their sexuality. Or as you said, there's even some people who want you to even take more distance, like make more layers between describing yourself and having a sexuality that's not
Hmm.
straight or whatever.
Yeah. So what about you, TJ? What does this look like for you?
I use the term queer and I use it for a bunch of reasons, but one is pretty similar to yours. It's more of an umbrella term, less of a pigeonhole term. Let me say more on that. But first, I'll just go back from even when I was younger and kind of talk about the progression of terms that I've used. When I was young, I kind of noticed I was seems attracted in when I was in high school age, I didn't have a word to describe it. And it was pretty, it's weird. It's like it wasn't the most prominent thing in my life, even though it was part of my life. I was focused on other things, like other things are more important. I think about my friends or my schoolwork or like things I like to do, my hobbies. And then even in college, I went to a Christian college. Still, I knew I was same sex attracted, but again, I didn't use a terminology really. I guess I might have used that one, same sex attracted if I had to talk about it, but there was no one around to talk about it. And the
Hmm.
side B
Hmm.
conversation
Yeah.
was pretty nude. So we just, again, even in college, it was less prominent because I was focused on my friends, more on preparing for the next chapter of life, my studies. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't
Yep.
I
Yep.
wasn't dating. It just wasn't a big, very prominent thing for me. After college, though, when I started to, enter the chapter that's often seen as adulthood in a lot of places, it started to come up more because I'd get more questions about marriage. I had to think about my sexuality, maybe more in some ways as, I was like, in my early 20s, this was more like a prominent desire for me, at least then. So I had to think about it more. And I think pretty early on, I settled on queer to describe kind of my sexuality. And in part, as I mentioned, it was because of that, not pigeonholed, like there's a certain ambiguity, which I appreciated. For a major reason was because for me, I felt like seasons where I've been really attracted towards women and then where I really thought marriage was possible. And I've had probably more seasons in my life where men seem more attractive. You know what I mean? But
Mm-hmm.
bisexual, quote unquote, that doesn't seem like for thing. It's never seemed appropriate for me because it seems like more seasonal, and it seems like there's been more seasons of attracted to men
Mm-hmm.
mostly. Is it?
Yeah, what I've kind of enjoyed about the term is that, it means strange,
Yeah.
right? Like, oh, that's an odd thing. That's a queer thing. And it's like, that's just sometimes how I really feel about my sexuality. It's
Yeah.
just like it's a little strange. I don't know how to pigeonhole it. There was these 2 years, in late college where I was like, oh, maybe, the homosexual stuff it went away and now it's all I might be asexual
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And and then it's just like, it's this amorphous thing. And it's like, yeah, it is strange. So sometimes my housemates get a little confused because sometimes I'll use the double entendre to say, oh yeah, that's a little queer or something, and meaning having both meanings in mind. And they're like, David, no one ever uses that to mean strange or weird anymore.
They do in other Englishes, like in Africa, some African communities, they still use it for that.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, they do. So it's kind of interesting.
Oh,
Yeah. It's
perfect.
perfect. Related to Africa, I also don't use gay, which could maybe, if gay is defined as predominantly attracted to men or the same sex, I guess. Typically men, because men use it more often sometimes, but whatever. That could fit me sometimes, but I don't use it because in the African community that I'm part of, to use it, the particular politics of homosexuality and the quote unquote gayness, how it emerged in that context is tied to the idea of gay as just someone who's actively currently having same sex. You know what I mean? Like it's a practice oriented
Do you think that
definition rather than experiential definition.
do you think that's different than the U.S.'s origins, or just different from the current U.S. context?
Good question. What I understand is that in the past in European Christendom, that like homo sex or same sex was focused
Hmm.
on practice oriented definitions, like
And they used
sodomy,
sodomy.
for example, for certain types of same sex male acts, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. So the practice oriented definition, but I think it's not too far to imagine that shifting to sodomite, someone who regularly does that act. You know what I mean?
So biblical translations where it used to say
Uh huh.
sodomites, like don't commit sodomy. It might talk about they would translate it sodomy. I don't know if sodomites ever made it into a
Hmm.
translation of a specific verse, but some more recent translations had at different points put it as
Yeah,
homosexuals.
true. Hmm.
Like the adulterers, the homosexuals, and so they were using that newer word, which came from like the 70s of homosexuals, in place of that same kind of idea of like sodomizer, people who are actively committing this. Even though, sorry if I might have cut you off before it, as I'm thinking through that, the US, historically the Christianity is using like sodomy, this action based,
Hmm.
but it became more psychological
Yes,
at the beginning of the 20th century,
you're
right?
so right. So that's a big difference. It'd be it'd be super interesting if someday we have a conversation on African translations of that word, because in some African communities that had indigenous words for the same concept, like someone who's currently actively having same sex, but
Hmm.
sometimes it's habit based, sometimes it was this psychological pattern based. Some cultural communities don't have an idea for that because there's a few cultural communities, at least a few, maybe more than a few, but some which having sex is not known of. Does that make sense? So there's not people
Hmm.
who do
Yep.
that. So yeah, it'd be really interesting somebody to talk about that. But this is not this podcast, but yeah, that is a big, it's a
Yeah, yeah,
big
yeah.
question. So what I can say kind of go back to what I was kind of focusing on briefly. I don't use gay because of that. Because in cultural communities that I'm part of,
Mm,
to use it would mean that I'm currently actively having sex, and I want to marry a man. So
mhm.
that neither of those fit my what's actually the case, So I would never use it.
Yep,
And
yep.
in fact, I have to mention this to you, David Frank. When I've been part of side B community, occasionally I've encountered side B people who are very focused on like, I am gay. Like that's a big part of their way of thinking about themselves, a side B Christian. And I'm always a little bit
Yep.
surprised because I'm like, well, okay, that's fine. Like there's more. I don't know why that term is so important to you. Cause from the cultural context that I'm kind of operating from with this in particular, we would not use that term ever because but they're using it in a different way that I'm using. You know what I mean? So the word is
Mhm.
infused with different meanings, even though it's the same English word that's being employed for a broadly similar thing, but the connotations and the nuance are quite
Yeah.
different.
Mhm. Mhm.
So at least I think it is. That's how I'm interpreting these people that I'm talking about in the side B community from the US. Can we just talk about why are we found using these terms helpful in our own lives? And we'll talk more about later reasons why people might use them. Has it been helpful to you to have this term and why?
I mean, I would say, the very basic is just, well, it's communication, right?
Hmm.
Like, how do I just communicate my experience to other people in a way that's recognizable? And I do that in lenses that make sense to these folks, whoever it is. So I use different language with different people. I'm just trying to communicate. And I think it has I've gone to the Revoice conference the past maybe 2 years or whatever. Yeah, three. I think it's three
Uh,
now. The last one was virtual with
yeah.
COVID. And, of like, oh yeah, like here's a group of people who share my experience, and they'll leave, they don't try to pigeonhole into categories. They'll kind of give the spectrum and of terminology. And it's just like, oh yeah, like, these are people who I can talk to who can, we can talk through practicalities of what it looks like to follow Jesus, given these shared dispositions or
Hmm.
maybe similar experiences. And it, yeah, it feels relatively simple for me.
Sure.
What about you?
I totally agree. Communication is one of the key ones. Like just to communicate something that's actually a true part of my life experience, that's the big one. Also, I've found it helpful to use a term in order to face face this part of my experience or my life, like in
Mm-hmm.
full, straightforwardly, with sincerity.
Yep.
So there's something there, and that's more part of personal growth sort of topics.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's another reason why I have found using this term clearly, because otherwise it seems like I fall into modes of types of repression, which usually produce bad fruits. That's basically the
Hmm.
alternative that I've had in my life.
Yeah. So rather than trying to like pretend that these you're not experiencing these attractions,
Hmm.
and so you just kind of try to describe your way around it. You just like, no, this is here, and that my response doesn't need to be shame and running away, but just tackling it head on and letting Jesus define me in the midst of that
Yeah,
experience.
I think by using these terms, at least in some contexts, I could most easily be honest before God and honest before the church, and meeting my friends and my loved ones. Yeah, but it's complicated because I'm not necessarily out, quote unquote, out to my circles. So I can't when I'm describing, I
Yeah,
can't say
yeah,
too strongly, but there's something of that honesty and sincerity is something that's been helpful just for me. So that's the only reason why I use these terms.
hmm
Yeah. So we talked about the reasons we might use these terms, but we all we're both very cognizant that these terms are controversial, as we mentioned. I know we're both in church
yep.
communities where there's controversy about this. We've heard about controversy. We know other people who have struggled with controversy about these terms. So let's talk about what are some common arguments against using the common queer terminology, such as queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual. What are some common arguments that usually Christians bring forth? Make
Yeah, I
it
think
bad.
the biggest one is about
Uh,
identification. People, it's actually really interesting to look at the kind of history of that word
mhm.
identity, and in the ways that it's really only over the past 100 or so years that that's become a big part of our vernacular
Mhm, mhm.
in the West, and that we're like, oh, well, and even I would say huge that you'll see a lot of Christian resources that are talking about your identity in
Yep,
Christ.
true.
And we're not saying that just because it's recent, it's wrong by no means, but just that that is how we are doing a lot of our conceptualization. We're trying to figure out who are we? Where's our belonging? What does it mean for me to be, a human, a man, to be David in particular? These are all, identity questions. And so as people have kind of articulated a lot of this of like, you don't want to idolize your work. You don't want your identity to be sucked up into your work. Your identity is in Jesus. That's your first priority.
Mhm.
And so their concerns is that by using, by identifying, by using these adjectives to say, I am uh, gay, I am queer, I'm a queer Christian, that you would be putting your identity not in Jesus, but be putting it in something else, let alone something that is potentially opposed to God's commandments, to his best way for us.
Mhm.
I'm just thinking about how, for that core identity piece, people often compare it like, well, it's tricky because they're doing two arguments kind of at once.
Mhm.
There's sometimes the core identity argument, and then there's the do you identify with potentially sinful things or explicitly sinful
Yeah, true.
things. So there's the core identity piece.
Yep.
So then on this identity piece, what do you, I guess, how would you explain that part?
I think you described it well. It's basically talking about something that's potentially sinful, or how can you talk about potentially sinful things in an adjectival form tied to a holy thing? Can you call yourself a
Hmm.
lustful Christian or adulterous Christian or a thieving Christian? You can't, is the logical implication. So thus, how could you call yourself a gay Christian? It's quite
Hmm.
common. It's a common way of kind of producing an argument about the incompatibility between the holiness of Christianity or the church
Hmm.
and the unholiness of gayness. Though I think this also falls into that trap we're talking about, where gay is it a practice for the definition, or is it a pattern of spiritual attraction definition? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a really big piece on what do we actually mean by the
Yeah,
word?
it's true.
Yeah. Are we describing a psychological thing? And even then, of like, well, is it merely a tendency towards a certain types of sexual attraction? Is it something a little more ambiguous or bigger than that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This could be a whole nother podcast
Uh-huh.
episode on in the terms of, so we talk about like sin and how we associate with it. So in the Bible, you'll have James calling Christians, he's writing to as sinners, and he calls them to
Sure.
repentance. And Luther takes, even though he didn't like the book James a whole lot, I think Luther was very big on saying we are simultaneously saints and
Mm-hmm.
sinners, and that the fact that we actually have to recognize that we are sinners, and then the glory of being absolutely justified as saints becomes all the brighter.
Mm-hmm.
So we're often pretty comfortable with that, depending on kind of which church culture you're in, of recognizing, oh yeah, I'm a sinner and I'm a
Mm-hmm.
saint, and I'm a sinning Christian.
Sure.
uh, that's usually par for the course. You don't, it's not your identity. Your core identity is, of course, that's been crucified and nailed to the cross. Hallelujah. So it's just complicated in terms of like what baggage these words hold, and they're often more about what feelings they invoke than actually about the precise description.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. There's a moral psychological dynamics working on where they're just, yeah, it's more about the feelings that the term evokes. In some way, this argument, like, I don't call myself a lustful or adulterous Christian, so how can you be a gay Christian? It, I think it often does rely on the idea of being gay is particular bad sort of way of being. But it really, again, depends on what they mean by gay as well. So let's
Hmm.
talk more
Hmm.
about this.
And so there's like, so this identity piece, which has its different kind of angles. And then there's just the really like kind of pastoral reasoning, like the practical implications for personal holiness is this: don't associate with something that you're maybe trying to repent from. So if someone is coming out of, various sexually active homosexual relationships, then if they're trying to repent of that kind of, those actual like lived out decisions in their lives, and it's like, well, don't hold on to that, hold on to that identity, but don't associate with that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Recognize kind of like that's not something that you have to be trapped in. And so it's this kind of aimed at this personal psychology.
Sure.
What do you think of that?
I use that dynamic in my own life for when I'm trying to avoid the sinful passions. I use that when you're describing in my own life sometimes as a framework for approaching, avoiding evil things. But I
Mhm,
think there's the underlying difference is how I think of what being queer, gay means or is. So
mhm.
there's a difference in presuppositions, which I think produces a different way of viewing it overall.
Yeah. So if you're like, you might say, TJ, I'm not slothful. I love the kingdom of
Hmm.
God. I'm going to work hard
Hmm.
today. And so you use that kind of like, I'm not going to associate with the slothful feelings I'm having, but I'm going to associate with
Yep.
this. And so people are like, well, so of course don't use gay. And it's just like, oh, well, I don't mean, lustful
Yeah,
when
I
I
know.
use
Yep.
gay. That it is this more complicated thing.
Yep. That's how side B
Uh,
Christians usually differentiate, I think. Like gospel is wrong ways of having sexual desire, right? Or using sexual desire towards wrong
mhm,
ends. But we don't necessarily think queerness or gayness is exactly that. Or you can
mhm.
participate in that, but it's distinct from that in some ways as well.
It talks about what your lusts are most likely to
Yeah, it's
be,
patterns.
but it mean that you're
Yep,
lusting.
yeah. That's
So in the same way, this kind of like personal psychology of like, don't associate with this thing to help you really renew your habits and your actions. There's also the desire of like, well, what community are you identified
mm,
with? Are you associating with the wrong group of people? And that might have personal implications, but it's a little bit more on kind of, yeah, I don't want to say it's not virtue signaling. How would you describe it?
I think all human groups virtue signal in a sense, but virtue signaling by defining in that way, it just makes it seem like insincere. But I mean, people just want to try to belong. They want to have moral status and belong to a good community that's pursuing the good. So when I think they want you to be formed in a good community and be associated with
Mhm.
what is true, good, and beautiful. So that's what they're trying to encourage you. May I share a story about this?
Yeah,
Sure.
please do.
So I was a couple weeks back, I was talking with my friend from college. I'll call her Emily. And Emily and I, we were talking about, we'll talk about this in more different podcast, but a recent decision by the Anglican Church of North America regarding terminology for its Christians who are queer. And we were talking about it. And then I ended up being side B, because I am side B. And my friend, without knowing the term, she really identified with side Y. And the main reason that she identified with side Y was its dislike of using queer terminology. And could be because she grew up outside the US, very influenced by, as a missionary kid, very influenced by charismatic movements. So she immediately said, using the term gay is tying yourself to spiritual strongholds of darkness. And
Mm,
identifying with these spiritual strongholds of darkness or identifying with the kingdom that's not God's kingdom. So it's a belonging argument related to this point that you're bringing, like you're somehow tying yourself to different communities. As a side B person, I was skeptical and I'm still unsympathetic to that argument, but that's kind of how that was her first way of processing it. And that was her main argument against using the terminology of queer.
it kind of makes me think of maybe how people first associate with rock and
Hmm.
roll. Um, that someone's like, "Oh, I love rock and roll," or I want to be in a rock band. And there was a generation that just associated that type of music with a specific, a raucous way of life, and obviously those things are intertwined, so it's complicated. But that's kind of feels like what's happening here.
I think you're right. There's similar dynamics to something like that. So that the community
Hmm.
is important.
Hmm.
Trying to, because of course all Christians want Christians to be well formed in God's church, you know? I think that's a pretty baseline Christian desire for ourselves and our people, you know? But anyway, so the gay becomes complicated with this sort of topic for some people.
the overall just kind of biblical argument that as people are trying to discern, okay, I'm unfamiliar with this language. So what can I look into the scriptures to learn about how we use words to describe ourselves? And they will look at, especially in the Old Testament, and the New Testament as well, there's huge importance of naming. So maybe a classical example would be Saul when he's confronted with Jesus, by Jesus, and then his name is changed to Paul. Abram and Sarai went from to Abraham and Sarah, and it was indicative of what God was purposing for them. And so people say, okay, like the names we give ourselves are really important. It's part of God's calling on our life, and so we shouldn't put false names on ourselves. I think it's always valuable to learn about just like these kind of biblical
Hmm.
emphases and these principles of naming, and it's a beautiful part, I think, of like just like how God has designed us and how He calls us, and even my own name of David has been a part of my own spiritual formation of
Sure.
like what does it mean for me to live into that name?
Hmm.
Going back to King David as a man, who was after God's own heart. So I feel that, but I think it's a stretch to pull that into every single adjective that you might use to describe
Yeah,
yourself.
I would agree. Also, I just want to make a note. There's also in a
Uh,
lot of the apostolic Christian traditions, like Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican, a lot of times people take on another name at baptism. So
mhm.
that's that kind of basically the point is naming has been important for the church from the biblical tradition and living out the
Yeah.
faith. But yeah, I would also question if and this adjective that we use to describe a pattern of attractions is something that's can't be tied to the Christian person. But I mean, that's our perspective as kind of side B people. So perhaps not unexpected.
And so kind of connected to that is this like, okay, so maybe it's like, okay, biblical naming, that's a little bit of a stretch, but can I find any biblical reason to use this kind of sexual orientation description language? And they would just say, no, like the Bible describes our sexuality in terms of male and female and eunuchs. And it talks about your acts, of whether you are committing sodomy or whether you're being faithful in the marriage bed. And so we should keep ourselves to only be using those same biblical frameworks in describing ourselves. Is that uh, a good explanation of this kind of like why people are saying sexual
Mhm.
orientation, LGBTQ, words don't seem to map onto those biblical
Yeah, I
constructions.
think it's a fair summary of the argument that people make. Yeah.
Okay. And and then this kind of connects into our last reason that people often bring up to not use these things. And that would be there's kind of two versions of it. One is just purely, well, LGBTQ, this is a social construction. And just by nature of it being socially constructed is thus itself invalidating of its use, and we should get rid of it. And the second, I would say more advanced version of that is, and this would be Rosario Butterfield, I think that does this more thoroughly, is let's actually look at how it was socially constructed and analyze whether that is faithful or can map onto or integrate with a biblical view of sexuality. And I think that is the better way. One example I like to bring
Mhm.
up with just social constructions is like people call themselves introverts and extroverts all the time. And that's also a 20th century social construction about how we think about social
Mhm.
engagement.
Mhm.
And so, like, everything is, language in particular is always under constant social
Yeah.
construction. And so you can't really exist without it.
No, humans can't. Yeah.
And even biblical translations are, having to deal with that too, as where do you have a quick example of like just like how biblical translation like has to undergo this like dealing with our modern self, the social constructions?
Yeah, I do. We did this right. So translation automatically puts a layer of like social construction through interpretation on any text. And be- it even like time, the distance of time between then and now put these layers of construction because our terms, even if we translate them, they don't necessarily, they mean broadly the same thing, but there could be nuances or connotations that don't quite match. Even occasionally, a pretty common example we talked about, I studied theology and anthropology as undergrad. And a topic that we sometimes came up with was at least some translation in English. They translated, we said about emotion in the Old Testament, they would translate it as the heart. For example, David's heart was turned this way towards this person. But in fact, what I was taught is that oftentimes the Hebrew, they were translating the guts because they thought emotions emanated from the guts, like the stomach area, right?
Where it'd be weird in English if you were to
Yeah,
translate that and be like, and David's stomach was turned towards this person. You're like, is he
yeah,
vomiting? Is
because
he
in
sick?
contemporary Europeans speak English, I guess the British, somehow emotions became tied to the heart in that cultural context or in those contexts. So now the idiom is heart. So there's a social construction when we say the heart because we're translating a related idiom from one to the other. But of course, it's different, right? It's the same, but it's also there's different emphases, different connotations. It's physically different, different parts of the body that we think are being moved or having emotion emanates from those parts. Large swaths of human
Hmm.
reality are socially constructed because we use language to approach the world.
So it gives us a lot of, I think, just humility as we try to create constructions
Yeah.
to know that these are always, we're trying to provide some mappings onto reality to help us think about it and engage it. And they're not monolithic in terms
Yeah.
of, how they're going to express themselves in every culture, every
Yeah.
language.
I think
Yes.
I really like the
But
maps analogy in particular. Yeah, that's right.
I'm about to mention Rosaria Butterfield again. Rosaria is an author of a book titled Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert. She used to be a very progressive activist in the feminist and lesbian space, and then had an unlikely conversion to Christianity, and now takes what we've talked about in other episodes as a side Y perspective, really wanting to not use this sexual orientation framework at all. So that's what I think Rosaria Butterfield is trying to say. Does this Freudian conception of our sexuality
Hmm.
map onto our biblical anthropology? And so she would, and she's was very active in the queer, particular lesbian movement,
Hmm.
and she knows just like how much they have bought into basically this ideology, this anthropology, that your sexuality is primarily defined by its desire. And so it would be horrendous for someone to deny you and your sexuality by denying your ability to fulfill your sexual desire.
Hmm.
She understands all sexual orientation language as kind of coming out of that
Yeah,
framework, and says, well, that framework is
sure.
terrible. That's absolutely terrible. And so we just need to do away with it. Let's stop using sexual orientation language so that we stop using this prioritized framework.
Interesting. I'm actually
Um,
pretty sympathetic to the project that she's pursuing, like to examine the frameworks and try to like be as faithfully Christian as possible. Even though I admit I come to a different like, final judgment than she does about these terms.
mhm,
But it's interesting because I feel that that resonance. Like I'm interested in the that work that she's kind of interested in, not that way of being like making sure our frameworks are as faithful as we can. But I still come to
mhm.
different judgment, I think, in the end. Yeah.
Yeah. A- And and I think the difference maybe that you would say is that while you agree that the idolization of personal individual
Hmm.
desire and that defining our humanity or our sexual desire or sexuality is completely unbiblical,
Hmm.
that it's not inappropriate to still be analyzing the orientations that
Yeah,
exist.
that's well spoken.
They're not
Yep.
fundamental.
I definitely agree with that. And we have to admit, though, we haven't mentioned this as much, but we alluded to this at the beginning. Every person's experience really shapes the terms they might use. Rosaria Butterfield
Hmm.
came out of a formerly lesbian relationship. She had a conversion, which
Hmm.
really moved her away from the queer community. She didn't like the terms. I've heard of other people who are in a similar position, right? They came from a
Yeah.
background where they were involved in gay sexual relationships or queer sexual relationships or lesbian sexual relationships, whatever. And that was for them a very bad experience and a major conversion experience. and I really moved away from using those terms. But then others of us have been, broadly in the church for a long time. Like I probably became a Christian when I was 14,
Hmm.
but I've been in the church for what, 15 plus years since then. But I never had that experience in being involved in negative subcultural communities or whatever, and having a major conversion outside of those, right? Like I was a Christian who was just, as a young Christian, I was like 14 and I was just experiencing what it meant to be queer and to deal with that as a Christian throughout my life in Christian community. So that, I
Hmm.
think
And
those
yeah, and
personal
I think
experiences
that's
shape you so much about terms. Yeah.
yeah, those personal experiences as well as the generational differences of
Yes.
the culture, of people whose only experience of gay people were watching the gay pride marches in the 70s or
Yeah.
something. And then versus teenagers growing up today where, it's going to be like 10+% of your
Are
classmates
calling themselves
are
queer or
going to be,
LGBT or whatever.
yep, throwing around
Yeah.
this language. And it's just like, oh yeah, these are just normal other people talking about, like this is potentially even pre-puberty,
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
not a whole lot going on. They're just trying to talk about their
This
feelings.
kind of moves us into our next kind of question or topic. Why has the US church focused so much on terminology? And I bring this up because this is the biggest topic people want to talk about sometimes. And I'm always confused or bemused because I'm like, there's so many more complex, interesting topics in the conversation
I have a
about
hypothesis.
Christians
What do you
and
think
same
it
sex
is?
sexuality. But it's just like, why don't you focus on this? Yeah, tell me. Go ahead. What's your hypothesis?
The American church is actually trapped in in the same cycles of identity
Hmm.
politics that the entire U.S. culture
Yeah.
is. That we get really obsessed with identifying who's in and who's out, who's you know conservative enough or who's progressive enough in
Mhm.
politics or in the church. It's who's orthodox, and faithful and biblical
Sure.
enough versus who's outside. And those, it's not that it's inappropriate to identify those lines, and I think there's importance, but I think there's a yeah of just like people wanting to make super clear that they're not associating with any unbiblical doctrine, and so they just want to create very large
Hmm.
boundaries. That's how I read the
Sure.
situation.
I agree with the focus on the moral psychology of having a strong purity emphasis. Like that, I think that's a pretty prominent way of like engaging it. And also because in the US, and also in other communities, but we'll talk about the US now, Christians see themselves like besieged by the LGBT movement or the lobby or whatever.
Mm.
So that makes them like we're ideological enemies, quote unquote. So we need to be like, no, 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 don't be part of them.
Yeah, so it's not just separation, but it is actually a
Yeah.
defense to say we don't want this idolatrous
Mhm.
ideology to be inflicted upon our church, our community, and especially our
Yeah.
children. And so I think they have valid concerns for not wanting their children to adopt very unbiblical
Yeah.
assumptions.
But it's hard. The thing is, for those of us who are in the middle somehow, like that's where it gets a little bit complicated, you know?
Mhm.
And the church has not often engaged us well about these things. At least in my experience, it hasn't. And from what I hear, the people who are older than us, it also hasn't from them as well. So can I also bring this up?
Mhm. Mhm.
Actually, when I talk to Christians who, like my friend Emily, who really don't like these terms, I tend to think it's also because they don't know many queer people. Does that make sense? I'm not out to Emily, so she doesn't
Yeah.
know that I'm queer. But over time, if you have friends who are queer, you just get to know them more as people rather than just like the ideological other or the culturally
Yeah.
repugnant other. But when you know someone, then you have to engage them as a person and figure out the nuances. So if I come out
Mhm.
to Emily and I'm like, Emily, I'm, queer and I'm side B, I'm curious what you would think. And I wonder if that would kind of
And
shape how she thinks about terminology, maybe.
let's wrap up with kind of lastly talking about what are reasons why queer or same-sex attracted people
Hmm.
might want to use these terms.
Sure. So I'm going to read a succinct, a very short, at least, quote from Mark Yarhouse, his co-author, Dr. Oya Zaporetz. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, Dr. Oya. They wrote a book called Costly Obedience, what we can learn from the celibate gay Christian community. couple years back. They're psychologists and they're kind of side B allies. But in this blog post that Mark Yamos wrote on his own website, which is I think called Psychology Christianity, he provides 6 reasons why in his research, side B people might want to use this language of queer, gay, bi, lesbian, whatever. So I'm just going to read them right now. This is what he says. There are many reasons why celibate gay Christians have discussed the rationale for this language. These include, number one, the simplicity and clarity related to using the common vernacular. Number two, a realistic alternative to not reducing their experience to same-sex attraction when they are told to only describe themselves as same-sex attracted, as it overlooks personality and other experiences that are seen as captured better with other terms. Three, to avoid association with an ex-gay narrative, which they and or others they know have experienced as problematic for a variety of reasons. Four, to recognize some commonalities with members of the broader LGBTQ plus community. Five, for missional purposes in terms of relating to the broader LGBTQ plus community. And six, to be a visible presence of someone that they would have wanted to know existed in the world when they were younger. So what do you think about those, David Frank? Did any of those reasons connect with your experience or resonate with you?
Yeah. I mean, I would say the kind of fifth
Mhm.
reason was the one that I started with, just that missional
Sure.
purpose of like, I just am trying to connect and be
Yeah.
relatable. That goes into one of just simplicity of
Mhm.
communication. And I don't have, yeah, a particular with number three, that kind of historical ex-gay narrative. I don't have a huge really baggage with that, but I've met people who
Mhm.
have, who this one wonderful dude who's older than I, he said SSA was his slave name
That's funny.
because it did feel like so much bondage of
Uh-huh.
shame by being kind of forced to that
Yeah.
language. And this is a man who's faithfully following the Lord as a celibate gay
Mhm.
Christian. What about you?
I definitely had one, simplicity and clarity related to using the common vernacular. I think that was the first one for me. But then again, yeah, I'm really interested in like kind of how we think about the homogeneous, like I think about like love for the same sort of it's the same basically. And
Mhm.
so I'm interested in the theoretical conversation, theological conversation. So I thought that sometimes does feel good to me because I think same sex attracted can also be reductive.
Yeah.
It doesn't not for everyone,
Yeah, so,
but it
yeah,
can
I
be.
feel like I've heard you talk about that where, like, as you did talk about your queer sexuality, and it's talking not just about your orientation of your potential
Uh-huh.
lust, if you were to, sinfully
Yeah.
lust, but it's talking more about this orientation of your heart or disposition towards relationships or the world, and even I've heard people talk about it, how it's part of their aesthetic interest in art
Yeah.
that they feel is under this umbrella of the word
Yeah.
gay.
You just mentioned really kind of ties to how I perceived it. Because even before I really had sexual desire, I really had desire to connect with other, when I was young, like other boys, basically. They just be good friends, best friends, brothers like that. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So I definitely feel that. So there's a little bit of the ex-gay narrative. I didn't go through ex-gay. I just know older people who have done it. And then basically the missional. So the big one for me also, number one and number five, the simplicity and clarity related to vernacular and the missional purposes. But I think
Mhm.
it does mean something to someone who's far from the church or is not a Christian. They've never been in the church in any way to hear that, oh, like we're common. There's a commonality between us. Because
Yeah.
for better, for worse, and this is also another podcast, but I usually think that being queer, it's like it's a prominent part of my experience. Not the most important, not my core, quote unquote, whatever. But just it shapes all parts of my life, or at least most parts of my life, you know? That's what I
Mm.
think of it. And it
And the last one, I think it contributes, the last one being a visible presence of someone they would have wanted to know existed in the world when they were
hmm
younger. That speaks to more of why I think I try to be
yeah.
out
hmm
in a, like, yeah, moderate manner or whatever. It's not like plastered all over social media or something, but it's something that I try to make a, like, acceptably known fact. I give people permission to share that part of my experience pretty
Sure.
readily. I want to trust people with that because yeah, I want people, youngsters in my church growing up that if they're growing up and they, have an experience or have some feelings and they're like, "Oh no, am I gay?" That if they're like, "Oh, you know, I've heard David talk about Mr. David talk about
Yeah.
that or
Hmm.
something," or and Mr. David's still,
Is it church trying to
he's
follow
single
God?
and he's following
Yeah.
Jesus and he's in a church, and so that there are a lot of people where when they realize that, oh man, this gayness in my life and my sexuality seems like something I just can't get rid of. That means I must not be able to be a Christian
Hmm.
anymore, and that's just really sad.
And I've also encountered people who make that dichotomy. So yeah, I think that's an important reason as well. Like I could be Christian or be gay.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Let's kind of wrap up. What kind of final summarizing thoughts do we have about things together, the scientific perspective related to these terms, like things
Hmm.
you want people to know?
Yeah, I think the summarizing, especially, say someone hopped in on this episode of the side B perspective, being that where we don't care about terminology
Hmm.
ultimately. There's this, yeah, great speaker at Revoice. She's in a panel discussion, Rachel Gilson, and she was just, I think she might be a literature major or something, saying like, we have no idea what language is going to be being used in 15 years,
Yeah.
let alone in 50. And so it's super contextual to just the moment we're in. And so please feel no pressure to use or not use a language just on some type of like arbitrary principle. But that it is a communal and pastoral of like, oh, what is the psychology, like that I need to work through in terms of like how I'm feeling about it and what it means for me and what it means for my community and how am I just communicating? So it's a matter of
Yeah.
wisdom is
Amen.
is kind of how we talk about it, and so we think that some of these concerns and arguments against, they're not necessarily like completely invalid, but I don't think that they're invalidating of ever being able to use the term.
Yeah, I agree. And the way I say it, usually like a prudential and pragmatic judgment with your community to have a wise terminology or wise term to describe yourself. That's what I think it is. I've argued this in the past, but side B, as you mentioned, doesn't mandate any terms. Again, prudential and pragmatic, oriented towards wisdom,
Hmm.
fitting in your particular contexts. So yeah, I think that's kind of where we're at. And
Yeah.
yeah, I find this is the most freeing of the options on offer. We get rid of terminology from the various sides. That's my position or my
And,
perspective. So,
and I think part of that
mhm,
freedom of like true Christian freedom, you know, it's not just a freedom from enslavement, but it's freedom unto, worship and loving what is
definitely.
good. And by not having to, stress out about what language I'm using, it allows me to focus on the practicalities of following Jesus
Yeah.
and of much more productive conversations. There's a time and a place for this, and at some level we all need to work through it, especially queer Christians. But it's not the end all be all. We're always going to be a little bit miscommunicating, confusing one another, needing to clarify, needing to ask clarifying questions, and that's fine. There's nothing perfect
Mm.
option out there, and even in a very small context, it's still just it is what it is, and so let's address it as needed, and then move on to saying what's Jesus calling us to do today? How are we to love God and love neighbor more? And yeah, and that's what I am eager for Christians to do. But I think it is valuable that we do spend some time just explaining because people, part of people's desiring to honor God is their reasons of trying to create these boundaries and such. So I get that. I respect that. And I hope we can hear each other out.
Well, I think with that, thanks for those great words. We should wrap up. Okay. Bye, everyone.